Hello and welcome to the home of creative photography. I'm Hayley from Creative Photo Folk, and as we come up to the end of the year, I must admit this week I'm really phoning it in with this project where you're going to learn how to create storytelling illusions using your mobile phone. Now, yet again, as with my last editing tutorial, this project also has the added benefit of showing you how to use layers, masks, and selections if you're new to Photoshop. Because I'd rather teach you using fun projects than sitting you down in front of Photoshop and explaining what everything does. That would be pretty yawn, but it's how most people teach. So for the first version of this we're going to create, I started out by photographing my phone. So it's basically house sitting for a friend. I stood on her back patio because I knew there'd be some nice bokeh and trees and stuff in the background. And I just held out my hand with my phone in front of my camera. I believe the camera was on a tripod, so I could just easily click the button and still kind of have the length to be able to hold my hand out in front. To get the right perspective and length, I've used a 50mm, so it wasn't too close or too far away, and the settings I used, as you can see here, so 1/200th of a second, I used f4, and I specifically chose f4 because I wanted that background to be quite blurry, and then I boosted it a little bit with an ISO of 400 just to get a little splash of light. Now, one thing I don't think I've ever mentioned, certainly not on this channel, is that when I shoot something, I massively overshoot it. Like I took 30 images, I think, of my phone just to get this one, and possibly even more that I've since deleted. So I don't want you guys to think that I or anyone really can get this right first go. It takes a lot of testing and a lot of different poses and a lot of different ways to hold the phone. So don't feel like you're doing the wrong thing if you are overshooting. This is perfectly normal. So basically, I opened that in Photoshop by going to Photo, Edit in Photoshop. Here we are. And so what I'm teaching you today is one of the simplest things you can do in Photoshop. Now, the image that we'll end up creating, which you would have seen earlier, looks like this. I'll show you a few variations as well, but let's basically get stuck in. So for this technique, you will have your base phone image, as we've just talked about. And that doesn't have to be a phone. It could be a camera. You could use the lens as the thing you want to mask into. It could be a computer screen, for example. Phone just seemed the most easiest and accessible. And then for the image that you're going to put into your phone, you need something that leads you into that image. So it might be someone, in this case, standing on a bridge. It might be a road. It could be anything that has some kind of directional properties, but also that is easy to cut out, like it has clear boundaries, if you know what I'm saying, like a bridge, for example. So normally I don't like to use stock. I would normally go out and shoot everything myself, specifically and particularly for something like this that is a bit storytelling. Like I like to be a little bit clever and create some kind of story. But in this case, as I said, I'm kind of phoning it in, and I just went through my back catalog to find something that would work, just so I could quickly show you guys. And I know a lot of you probably are working with stock and you are going to be limited about what images you use and what stories you can tell. And if you do shoot your own image, particularly for this technique, there is certainly a lot of creative potential here if you do give your concept some initial thought. So let's get down to it. So I showed you how to open your first layer in Photoshop, or your first image. Next, we want to bring in our second image. Now, I can't do that because it's not on this hard drive, but let me just show you for example. I'll grab, let's say, this cat. So if I went to Photo, Edit in Photoshop, just as we did before, and it's going to open it into a different window. And then what you can do, and there's lots of ways to do this, you can go Control-C for copy, and then Control-V to paste it. My favorite way is to making sure my move tool is selected. The shortcut is V. I just drag it up and onto the tab of the other document, pull it down, and that just pops it in. And sometimes it will need resizing. If that's the case, you would just press Control or Command T to bring up your transform tools, and then you can drag in the corners, etc. to resize. Hit the tick when you're done. So at this stage, you should have your phone layer at the bottom and then your bridge or road image sitting above it. So you'll have two layers at this stage. Now, what we need to do is make a selection of inside the phone. Now, looking at this phone, these days, the phone is all screen. All of this inside the little bracket is screen. So if you want to select your whole screen, you can, but then you are stuck with the job of also having to cut out any speakers or any buttons. So in this case, what I did is made a selection where it was actually squared. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly show you both ways of cutting out. So if you did want to choose your whole screen, we could start with the pen tool. It is probably the trickiest tool in Photoshop, but it's also the most accurate. And what we do with the pen tool is, and to access the pen tool, it's just the shortcut P. And so what we do is we make little points with the pen tool, and we can make really big far away points, which is great for a straight area. But when you've got little corners, it's best to make little points. Now, everyone uses the pen tool a little bit differently. So that's how I like to use it. I like to make lots of little points. But you might come across people who make a point here and then a point here, and then they pull this until it creates a curve. I find that a bit fiddly, so I don't usually do that, but you can. And so that's how you would create it if you wanted to select the whole thing, and then you'd have to go to the effort of cutting out your little bits as well. I'm not going to do that, so I'm just going to actually go into my history and go back to before we made that path. And instead, what I'm going to do is make a point here, then a point here. If I hold down Shift, it will draw a straight line exactly across. So that's what I did just then. Going to do the same down here. Then I'll hold down Shift again, and there we go. Now, to turn your little selection here into a proper selection, it's not a very good selection. What I would actually do is zoom in and really check what I'm doing. It's not the worst though. And what I would do now with the pen tool still loaded, so with P, I would right click inside this selection and click Make Selection. Now you're going to get some options here. At this stage, I'm just going to use 0, anti-aliased, and new selection and hit OK. And now we have our selection. So with our phone layer selected, I will just now add a layer mask. And so the layer mask is found with this little rectangle and the hole in the middle. And now what that has done is taken the bit that we've selected and dropped out everything else, which is not what we want. We want the opposite. Now, when that happens, you can press Control or Command I on your keyboard, and that will invert your mask. So now we are seeing everything from that phone layer except what I selected. And now what's showing through is the other layer. I think before I said I had my phone layer on the bottom and then my location one on top. That is not the case now. So that is now sitting under, so you can see through that selection I made to the layer below, which is the bridge image. Now you will see that I have moved my bridge image into place. So it is, let's turn that off, resized. So it's a little bit smaller. So you want to make sure at this stage that your image is in exactly the right place. And let's just talk about that. So ideally you want your bridge or your road or whatever to be coming up to pretty much the corners and to be fitting in nicely. So if you do need to resize that layer, make sure it is selected, press Control or Command T to bring up your transform tools, and then you can resize like this. You can move it with your Move tool by clicking V and then moving it into position. And then when you're done, if you were still in the transform tool, you would just click your little tick. Now I don't want any of that, so I'm going to click back to previously. So this is pretty good. This is what you do if you wanted to have an image inside your phone, but we're going to take it a little bit of a step further and then have the bridge extending out. So how do we do that? Well, we make sure that this layer, so not the phone layer, but the bridge layer is selected. And I'm going to press Control or Command J to duplicate that onto its own layer. So you'll see now that there's two. I'm going to take this layer and drag it up above the phone layer. Now what we're going to do is just make a selection of our road or whatever it is that you have here. So again, I'm going to use the pen tool. You could use any other selection tool, but selection tools are a huge, huge thing to talk about. That's why I have a whole class dedicated to them in my Creative Photography Accelerator. But for now, we're just going to use the pen tool. And again, we'll make little clicks. And I'm going to just make a few, not heaps. Now that one isn't quite lining up. And you can press Control or Command Z to undo if you're unhappy with a point that you've made. And then you want your points at the end to meet. Now this bit at the top isn't so important because it's going to be in the phone and we've already got that image. But anything out of the phone is what we really need to make sure is selected properly. Now the great thing about roads and bridges is that they are fairly simple to select. So now right clicking inside, going to make selection. Okay, now we've got our selection. I'm going to add a layer mask. And in this case, it's done a right job. We wanted the bridge and now we've got the bridge. Essentially, our image is done. So we could make any corrections that we wanted to do. Now, before we end on this particular image though, I will show you one more thing that you could do. And that is to make a selection of your hand and your phone. So we'll go back onto that layer, make sure the layer is highlighted. We're going to use a different selection tool this time. We might use the object selection tool. So you find that by clicking and holding down your mouse on the fourth tool in the toolbar. And then we want to make sure the object selection tool is selected. And then we can find things in the image to select. Now I want the phone and the hand, but it's only really doing them separately. So there's a couple of ways I could do this. I'm just going to click the phone to say, yes, I want that selected. Then I'm going to shift click. So shift adds to a selection and click the hand and see what happens. Pretty good. The good thing about hands and phones is that they are fairly easy to select. And now, making sure that the layer mask is selected on the phone layer, not the phone itself, I'm going to go to select inverse up here. So select inverse. What that's going to do is select everything but the phone and the hand. So all of this background. Sometimes it's just easier to select an object than it is a background, and that's why I do it in reverse. Now we want to tell our layer mask that we want all of this area to be black. So I'm going to go to Edit, Fill with Black, because we want that part of our layer mask to be invisible, and black makes things invisible. We'll hit OK. And what it has done is kept the phone, kept the hand, dropped out the background. So to get rid of this selection, I'll press Ctrl or Command D. And this is another type of illusion you could create. So instead of keeping the phone background, as we did, you can have the original background. So up to you which one you run with. Now, I'll show you one more example while we're here. A little bit different again. And so in this one, we have a phone that's lying down and a subject popping out the top, so rather than the front. So again, in this image, the base, so the phone sitting on the table, is actually a stock image. And then the photo of the girl with the flowers is actually me in a wig and a dress. There is a little bit of a storytelling aspect to this. So I wanted to show a girl doing something sort of mindful and naturey and out in the world, but see her in a phone, because we're often glued to our phones and not out in nature and the world. So this was sort of a little bit of a social commentary. It's possibly a bit lost because it's not so obvious, but that's what I was trying to achieve. So that's something you too can think about. So let's have a look at how I created this one. So basically this is a stock image. Now I don't have the original stock image. I will link it below. Then we had to make a selection of the phone to have our little character pop out. And you'll see in this case, this phone is more of an old school one that had the square screen. So that is quite helpful. So again, to make our selection, and I'm going to do it real rough this time because you've seen how to do it, you make your points. I'm going to right click, make selection, hit OK, got our selection. So this is that image that I shot. I shot it in a field near my house. I shot it specifically to be for book covers. So I went out there specifically to do a little lifestyle shoot that could be sold as book covers. And so then I added the layer mask to her. And all we now see is what's inside the phone. So again, we have to make a copy of this layer with Ctrl or Command J, which I've already done. Here it is. And then I had to carefully cut the girl out. Now she was a little bit tricky. So I'll quickly show you how I did it. Went back to the object selection tool, clicked on her. It didn't do a bad job. I just had to do some fiddly stuff with her hair and some of the flowers. And so I recommend if you are trying this, maybe don't use a field of flowers because then you might have to individually cut out some of those flowers. So I added the layer mask and there we go. There's a couple of issues with the hair and with the edge of the dress. I'm not going to get into that too much now. Let me just show you a few extra things. So what I had to do is, beyond the selection I made of her, I also carefully painted a little bit of grass in because without the grass, see how it was cut out? So I had to carefully paint that in. Some other things that were cut out if we look around is her bunch of flowers. So I had to carefully paint that in. And the other thing is I thought it looked a bit funny where it cut off and there was no grass coming over the top. And this is why I really don't recommend using long grass or flowers because they would be popping out naturally over the top. So I did do a little bit of extra work there and I'll show you that. So you can see that I painted those little strands of grass back in individually. And I also got a little bit of the grass and painted it back in as well. So what I did is I painted white on the layer mask to say, hey, I want to show a little bit more of this. That's a bit more involved than what we'll go through in this tutorial, because if you are new to Photoshop, that could be a bit overwhelming. So we will stop there, but hopefully you've learned a thing or two about masking. That's it for this week. If this tutorial has inspired you, or even if you've just learned a thing or two, please give me a like, subscribe, or comment below to let me know you're enjoying what I share on this channel. Until we meet again, happy creating.